Sorry, folks, for the little hiccup there. All right. So let's do our little intro. And first of all, hello and welcome to the second episode of Climate Change Chat for Realists. I am your host, Steve Donnelly, as well as the writer, director, producer, and announcer for the show. Our first episode with Dr. Gerald Kootenai talked about his efforts to battle climate deniers on Twitter, and you can check that out on YouTube on our channel. Today, we continue with this science denial theme, a topic I'm both horrified over and obsessed with, hopefully in a constructive way. Our guest today is someone who can likely help me determine that, a psychologist who literally wrote the book on science denial, Dr. Gale Sinatra. Her book, entitled Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It, is co-authored with Dr. Barbara Hoffer, hopefully I've got that pronunciation correct, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. It was released just this past July by Oxford University Press Scholarship. Dr. Sinatra is a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California and the Stephen H. Crocker Professor of Education at Rossier. Her areas of expertise include climate science education, evolution education, learning theory, knowledge construction, conceptual change learning, literacy acquisition, assessment, and the public understanding of science, which I gather is why she's here today. Dr. Sinatra, welcome to Climate Change Chat. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm really delighted to be here with you today.
All right, and thank you very much for the work, for the book. I read it very thoroughly, and I guess I could say it confirmed all my biases. Very much understood what you were talking about. It's a lot of the things I picked up in my kind of investigation of what happened with climate change denial many years ago. But we'll talk about that. First, let's talk a little bit about you, and we'll go way back. I guess you went to UMass, is my understanding?
Yeah, I'm a psychologist, and I did my undergraduate, master's, and PhD at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, which is unusual for people to
in my
stay at
backyard.
the institution that long for 3 different degrees, but I did, and I loved it there. And I was faculty at the University of Utah and UNLV for years, and then I'm here now at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
And how long have you been there now?
10 years here at USC.
That's a pretty prestigious institution, from what I gather.
It is. It has a lot of amazing research going on here. Yep.
And now, are you a professor or researcher, a little bit of both?
I'm a professor, so like most professors, I have a portfolio of research, teaching, and service. So I do all 3.
And this is graduate studies. Am I correct on that?
I'm teaching freshmen right now. So I teach freshmen, I teach master's degree students, I teach PhD students, I teach doctorate students. So I've taught the gamut in my career, and I'm currently teaching in this semester a myth-busting class with my freshmen who are doing research on busting educational.
Oh, nice. Well, my English professor back in college would talk about myth busting, so I guess it applies to many kinds of arts. All right, so how did you get an interest in psychology? Why psychology?
Well, I've always been interested in psychology. I took a high school class in psychology and evolution. So one half of the semester was psychology and the other half was evolution. And I thought everybody took that in high school. Turns out not so much. And I went on to do an undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in evolutionary biology. So I kind of could have gone either way in my graduate studies, and I ended up in a PhD program in psychology.
What part of the country? I maybe detect a little accent. Is that right?
Well, UMass, so I'm a Bostonian.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm from Springfield, so we're neighbors.
Oh, okay. So my mother was from Cambridge. My dad was from Everett, and I grew up in Medfield, outside of the Boston area, and
Well,
I've pretty much lost most of my accent, but good for
I
you
thought it
for
was a
seeing a little bit of it
little
in there.
Southern accent, but all right. So
No, definitely not.
how did the book come to fruition? What motivated? And is this your first book, or where is this on your kind of career path? The book.
Well, I've edited books before with contributions from other scholars, but this was my first co-authored book with Barbara Hofer, and we have been collaborating on research for many years. And we ended up going to a conference together, sponsored by the NSF, National Science Foundation, and the German equivalent. And this was hosted at the UN, of all places, and the topic was public understanding of science. After that meeting, which was attended by psychologists and journalists and all different kinds of researchers, we collaborated on a couple of articles together, and we realized we had more to say on this intriguing topic of public understanding of science, and that's how the book came about.
Gotcha. And what exactly is the tie-in with psychology and science? It's not something, as far as science denial, I should say. What's the angle there?
Well, we're both psychologists, and what we have been studying for a long time is the psychology of how people understand and misunderstand science. So you could call that the epistemology, the nature of science itself, the nature of knowledge. How do people know what they know or think they know what they know about science? And so the psychology of it is really a large part of the struggle that people have to understand or accept science.
And can you give me, so, my background is very limited in psychology. I took, a Psych 101 course. I read some pop psychology and that kind of thing. I feel kind of out of touch with modern psychology and, the kind of tools that you use to investigate, these kind of very nebulous ideas like epistemology. I mean, it's not like physics where you can easily measure masses and this kind of thing. I mean, the brain is, much more difficult to characterize with numbers. So, what tools do you use to assess what's going on inside of people's heads?
Well, psychology is difficult to do research in because people are more complicated than physics in many, many ways. So I
Right.
always say to my students, I wish I'd been a bench lab scientist because you can measure chemicals in a beaker and you can get an exact measurement. But science of any kind isn't easy, and the science of psychology isn't easy either. There's just multiple methods that people use. We certainly observe people's behavior. We interview people. We ask a variety of questions, questions that tap their knowledge. What do they know? Questions that tap their beliefs. What do they believe to be true? Questions that tap their attitudes. Are they pro or against a certain um, policy stemming from trying to mitigate climate change? So between interviews and observations and behavioral data, we like to say we triangulate these findings. In other words, we look at them from many different angles until we can discern some of the psychological principles that we share in our book. We look at emotions, for example. People are very climate anxious. Those people who understand that the climate is changing are very anxious about it. People who resist that information are angry about maybe having to change their lifestyle in a way they don't think is necessary. So there's emotions on both sides of science issues. We also look at things like motivations, motivated reasoning. There's some things we would prefer to be true, and some things that we kind of reason towards the a view that we want to accept rather than trying to reason towards an accurate understanding of a situation. So there's motivations that drive people's thinking and reasoning. So there's a variety of different psychological principles, and each chapter in the book goes over one or more of those.
Yes. Well, we're definitely going to talk about the book at length a little bit later. Still want to cover some of the more basics. I mean, just from a lay person's perspective, I mean, when you do these studies, what's just the setting to help me visualize it? Do you bring people into the university? Do you call them on the phone? I mean, how are these studies typically done with people?
Just any method that psychologists can think of. So people are interviewed, sometimes one-on-one. People answer surveys or questionnaires, either in person or online through a survey sent out to them. People's behaviors are certainly observed, recorded. People are given tasks and problems to solve. So there's a variety of methods. It's not just one method. So I can't give you a single method because there's just a
Gotcha.
variety of methods that people use. And an important aspect of any science, including psychology, is to look at the findings over multiple studies and multiple methods. So one study is definitely not a reliable source of information, either about psychology or about COVID or about climate change.
Now, imagine there's more skepticism of these kind of softer sciences, quote unquote, as compared to something like physics, because it seems to me that everybody can think and everybody has an opinion on what other people are thinking, and um, it just seems that people might be more skeptical. Do you find that to be true, or no?
Well, sure, but not everything in physics is as easy to measure and observe either. Black holes, for example, that's pretty difficult to measure and observe and understand. So it isn't. I don't really buy the hard science, soft science distinction as hard sciences get to the truth easily, and the soft sciences are really mushy and can't come to any predictions or explanations. I don't really buy that distinction because I don't think the lines are as brightly drawn as all of that. So I do think there's reliable findings in physics, and I do think there's reliable findings in psychology as well.
Absolutely. Well, I would agree. I just want to help kind of, because there are a lot of people who are, I don't want to say cynical is probably not the right word, but who are just generally kind of mistrustful. They may see things in the popular press that turn out to be false, and then they may think that the science can't be trusted, and that kind of thing. So thanks for shedding a little bit of light on that. And kind of zooming out a little bit, your book is called Science Denial. So let's just break that down into two parts. The first part is science. So let's talk in very broad terms. What is science?
Well, science is a process, and people often think of science as a collection of facts, and that's sadly because it has frequently been taught that way in schools in K through 12 education. But that's not what science really is. Science is a process, and it's a process for discovering information about the natural world. So that's what science is. And, people think sometimes it's a lot more than that, which it isn't. It has its limitations. For example, science doesn't tell us about, how to be good people, or it doesn't have any particular moral lessons. As Stephen Jay Gould famously said, there are no moral lessons in science. So science can't be more than it is. It is this process of developing information about the natural world that provides explanations and allows us to make predictions about that natural world. But it's also not less than that. So people think it's just a collection of facts. And when we have that view that science is a collection of facts, it's really not surprising when people were quite disturbed when the information about COVID shifted. For example, first we were wiping down our groceries, and then we realized that that wasn't going to be helpful. And then we started
Right.
wearing
I did
masks,
that.
and people mistrusted science and said things like, oh, they lied to us. Well, they really just did not understand transmission of the novel, meaning new, coronavirus right away. So the entire country, actually, the entire world, got a lesson in the process of science as we saw it unfolding in front of us. And science is messy and imperfect, and we saw it trying to sort of build the plane while we were flying it. And that kind of made people very concerned because they may have thought that science was more definitive than that. But of course, when information is new and evolving, it's going to change, and more information comes forward. And that's the strength of science, not the weakness. The strength of science is that it changes with new information, and
Right.
that isn't a weakness.
Well, let's talk about the process as it's practiced today. I didn't think much about the scientific process as a kid. Certainly wasn't taught in high school. Didn't learn about peer review. I mean, it's just something I read about and heard about, but I didn't think much about it. I just thought, scientists, they probably know what they're doing. They're not always going to get it right. I mean, that seemed kind of obvious to me. But I never really thought about the actual process. So can you talk a little bit about the process as in, the peer review process, how that works, maybe some of the things that don't quite work well with that process, what might need to be improved with it. Um, I mean, so I guess in the context of COVID, what was the process for determining, um, how deadly this disease was, how it was transmissible? I mean, who were the scientists that got together and reviewed each other's work exactly?
Well, I'm not an expert in medical science. I'm a psychologist, so I don't know the medical research that led to how we treated COVID, but I can tell you more generally about how science works as a process and peer review. But things were very different during COVID because information was coming in fast and furious, and a lot of some of the normal processes of science were deliberately sped up, or new information was released probably before it typically would be in a typical scientific process. So peer review just means that when I write a paper with my graduate students, which I do all the time, I send it to an academic journal, and the editor sends it out to peers, in other words, people who are expert in the area, and they review it. It's done blind most of the time, not always, meaning they don't know who the author is, and we don't know as authors who the reviewers are. And they give feedback and critique, and if they feel the paper has merit, you can fix those critiques and then publish it. And if they feel it doesn't have merit, they will say it should not be published. And that's basically the peer review process.
So what you said there, one key thing is that it's done blind, meaning the reviewers don't know who wrote it. And that speaks to a chat that we just got in, which says peer review is also commonly known as a popularity contest. So I think there's a very bad misperception out there that, these scientists are just, helping each other out to further each other's careers, or, oh, I like that person. And, they're in my in group and my tribe. And so I'm supporting that scientist. I mean, how real is that?
Well, science is conducted by humans, and humans are flawed, and humans are biased, and humans have preferred theories and preferred ways of thinking. So while the peer review process is subject to all the human frailties of any human process, that is absolutely true. I've suffered from that, myself. And as an editor of journals for years, I've hopefully haven't, but probably have had bias enter into my thinking about a manuscript as well. But the reason there's, multiple peer review opportunities, multiple reviewers, multiple journals is, generally speaking, if the work is good, it'll get out there one way or another, even if it's rejected by one biased editor or one biased reviewer, which of course indeed does happen all the time. If the work is good, it'll generally get out there eventually.
And you talked about one specific scenario. I think you drew from or Xerxes' book about plate tectonics. For a number of decades, there was a lot of bias on plate tectonics, but eventually that was broken through, and the truth won out eventually.
Well, one thing that we really emphasize in the book is that you should never believe an individual scientist
Right.
or an
Yes.
individual study, because an individual scientist, of course, can have biases, and an individual study could be, flawed. And so, what you want to put your trust in is what we call consensus science, which means
Right.
Look at the IPCC report. So this is the Intergovernmental Panel Report on Climate Change, the most recent of which was contributed to by a couple of hundred scientists, and it had about 14,000 studies that have been reviewed in that recent report. And when the vast majority of all those scientists and studies are leaning towards the same conclusion, that's what we call consensus science. And essentially the scientific information will on balance come out when you have that many different actors. The balance will be that the biases and the mistakes and the flaws will come out in the wash, as it were, when there's so many research studies pointing in the same direction. So yeah, people
Right.
should in fact be skeptical of reading one article that says you'll lose weight if you have chocolate on your toast in the morning. I've read
Right.
that study. It's not a very great study because it's a one-off and it had a very small sample, only about 22 people. And I wouldn't trust that study.
Well, that
So you wait until there's a consensus of multiple studies and multiple scientists contributing, and something like the IPCC report is something worth trusting given the depth of and breadth of the information there.
right. Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the things like the chocolate on the toast or whatever it was. We hear all these conflicting studies all the time, especially in the nutrition area. And I think that can kind of tend to lead people to think, oh, these scientists, they don't know what they're talking about, which is not the case. I mean, there's different branches of science, and
Yeah,
it's
nutrition
complicated. Yeah,
science is the worst, and it isn't because
yeah,
nutrition scientists aren't good scientists. It's because the participants aren't great participants. So if you ask me, did I cheat on my diet this morning? I might say no because I'm embarrassed, or I might not report that extra blueberry muffin that I ate this morning. So it isn't that nutrition scientists are not great scientists. It's that nutrition science is really hard to do. And also you
gotcha.
can't just sort of take, 1,000 people and force 500 of them to eat this diet and 500 of them to eat that diet. They go home, they eat what they eat, they say they did the diet, but did they?
I can imagine.
So, I mean, nutrition science is just extraordinarily hard to do. And so it's not as reliable as we'd like to think. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see information shifting in nutrition science so dramatically.
All right, very good. Well, I think the bottom line is science works. I think we agree on that. It can be a messy process. Sometimes it doesn't work as well as we would like, but in the end, it is the single best way of processing and collecting knowledge and learning about ourselves and the world around us. But that,
Well, it's like we say about democracy, or at least I've heard people say, that's the the worst form of government, except if you compare it to every other form of government, right?
right?
So
Yeah,
it's like that with science. Yes, science is flawed. Science has challenges, but it is the best method we have for finding out about the natural world compared to anything else.
correct.
That
Right.
doesn't suggest it's perfect, and it isn't a steady march towards truth. Science has many flaws, including racial bias, gender bias, has a long history of bias, but that's simply because it's conducted by humans, and humans have these biases, and so that is in fact true. But science does have a self-correcting mechanism, which is over time, as more studies are done, it can correct itself, which is it also one of its great strengths.
Well, my beef is people who just ignore very established science, who pretend that doesn't even exist. But we'll get to that kind of thing. All right. So enough about science. Huge topic. I mean, there's only so much we can cover in a few minutes, but let's move on to denial. One thing that struck me while reading your book is, maybe you might have a different idea of what you call denial and what I would call denial. I want to kind of flesh that out. So there's scenarios in your book, for example, of the religious guy. He's a freshman in school, and he's kind of coming to terms with the what he's taught in biology, and he's struggling, uh, with whether or not evolution is real and so forth. Now, I wouldn't consider that to be denial. I mean, that's just more ignorance is probably the wrong word, but just not being scientifically aware of what the established facts are. So a lot of the book talks about those types of scenarios where people are somewhat ignorant and about how they can become more aware of science. But now, I would kind of offset that with someone, and I didn't see much talk about it in the book, but of someone who just flat out denies science, who's into conspiracies. I mean, is there a spectrum of denial, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes,
And
of course.
yeah,
So in the book, we really talk about science doubt,
yeah.
denial, and resistance.
Hmm.
And we should probably talk about skepticism as well. So denial is basically a belief-based attitude. So you are using your beliefs and you are have a specific attitude towards information.
Okay.
And very few people are full on complete science deniers. That's very rare. For example, people go to the Flat Earth Convention and they fly in on a plane and they drive there in a car and then they tweet about their convention on their phones. And so they use modern science and technology every day. So there's very few people that are in full on denial. That's actually very unusual.
Hmm.
Most people, and it isn't an us or them thing, and by most people I mean us, all of us, including ourselves, are more like cafeteria deniers or acceptors. So the cafeteria denial we talk about is people who pick and choose what they want to believe about science. And science doesn't work that way. You can't just pick and choose what information you want to accept and what
Right.
information you don't want to accept. But that's really the biggest category is people who pick and choose what they want to believe and what they are very skeptical of.
And
And doubt
they may listen to
is,
certain people that agree with them, for example, right?
well, yeah. So doubt, let's talk about that. So we talk about doubt a lot in the book. Doubt is often manufactured. If you look at the work of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, they've wrote a book called Manufactured Doubt. And
Right.
doubt in science is manufactured or has been manufactured on issues like evolution and climate change for decades. So this is a concerted effort to raise doubt and suspicion about science to undermine it. And her book is really important for anyone to read about the manufacturing of doubt.
Well,
So,
that's one thing I want to.
Exxon knew about climate change back in the 60s and 70s and actually had climate researchers working for them until they sort of switched their tune and began to pump out misinformation that created an atmosphere of doubt. So, doubt is a feeling we have about science that is often manufactured.
That's definitely one thing I want to come back to. I want to, talk about the psychology of these people who would purposefully deceive others, and that's what gets me angry. And I definitely want to talk about that. So before our time is up. All right. So we talked. You mentioned previously. Um, you don't want to believe an individual study or an individual scientist. But you'll often see, oh, that person has a PhD. They must know what they're talking about. Or that person has a Nobel Prize. They're so much smarter than you. Obviously, they're right. So, how do you bust that way of thinking that, hey, here's this one expert and here's why he's right because he's goes to MIT and he's got a PhD?
Well, I think people are intimidated by scientists and people, with advanced degrees because they find them intimidating But I've been in academia for 30 years, and I've met a lot of people, most of whom are smarter than me, and they really aren't that intimidating. They're just people like you and me. So that's part of it, is people should not be intimidated by people who have advanced degrees, and not be intimidated by expertise, but we should learn from expertise. So if I want information about the coronavirus, I want to talk to an infectious disease doctor. I'm not going to listen to an athlete or an actress or a politician. They all have expertise, but not in infectious disease. So expertise comes from experience and knowledge. And so we want to listen to experts who have experience and knowledge in the areas that are relevant. And multiple experts. Again, it's about consensus. I wouldn't listen to one doctor or one climate scientist. The idea would be to get a consensus view of prominent doctors. For
Right.
example, look at how many doctors got the vaccine. I don't know the exact number, but I know it was well over 95%. That tells you something. When you look at the consensus view of the safety of the vaccine, that's extraordinarily high. So experts are people who have relevant knowledge about the topic at hand and experience with the topic at hand.
Right. Exactly. So it basically comes back to you've got to look at the entire body of scientific work. Now, as we'll talk about a little bit, it's impossible to do that, and we'll talk about ways to kind of figure out what the actual science says on a particular topic. One area I've always been interested in is education. I think it's extremely important. That's one thing that got me started kind of down this path of just kind of wacky people who believe wacky things against all evidence. So in 2009, there was a city councilor who's trying to cut the school budget, and he was saying crazy things like, "Oh, we're going to go bankrupt next year. The city's going to be wiped out. We got to cut teacher pay, teacher salaries." And this just got me really irate. So, I value education a great deal. My son, was a 6-year-old kid at the time in schools, and I decided, I was going to push back against this guy. So, education is absolutely critical. And I know you've done some work in that field, obviously. And it's the National Science GG. What is that again?
Oh, the
Uh,
NGSS.
NGSS.
So
That's it. Yeah.
NGSS is the next generation science standards. So in the United States, we don't have federal standards for education. States determine what's taught in science and every other topic. So there's what local control in education. But the next generation science standards are recommended uh, ways to teach science. So one thing that's great about the next generation science standards is that they teach science as a process, as we were discussing earlier, rather than a collection of facts. And so what they do is they engage students in the scientific practices, the practices scientists use, for example, asking questions, evaluating evidence, weighing a theory against another theory, looking for explanations. So they engage students in those same practices that scientists engage in themselves. And when that's done well in K-12 education, students can really learn a lot about science and the nature of science and what science really is. And so I would recommend states adopting the next generation science standards.
Yes, that was my next question. How is this being rolled out? Is it being rolled out? So right now it's at the state level to roll out these programs?
Well, all education is at the state level in the United States. Uh, there's no
Guidelines,
federal
yeah.
curriculum. There's no federal standards in the United States. There are in many other countries, but not in the United States. So everything is always at the state level in the US in education. The next generation science standards are recommended standards that states could adopt, and many states have adopted them. I think the number is 38, but I'm probably wrong about that. So it's
Hmm.
maybe more now. But it would be great if all states adopted them, or adopted similar approaches to teaching science as a process.
Excellent. Well, that's good news. I mean, I'm always looking for good news these days. So I'm glad to see that, there are attempts to try to improve science education. I think that's key for the future. Now, how it helps in the immediate, the present, is another question we'll come to. All right. Let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the book. Now, you identified five different constructs. Um, First of all, let's from what is the construct? I mean, I use the word all the time, but I don't really have a clear idea of what a construct exactly is. It's some kind of framework or tool, mental tool that we use to think about these things. Is that basically right? Or
Well, it's the way that we describe a concept in psychology that we have theories about how it works. So, for example, emotion or personality are constructs, and that's our understanding of how these things work in our psychology. So, we do talk about emotions. We talk about motivation. We talk about identity. So that's a topic we haven't talked about here today, but that's a really important construct for how science denial works. Identity means, do you identify with a particular group, and what is that group's thought on science? You tend to follow your group quite a bit in the thinking, accepting or not accepting a particular scientific explanation. So
and
identity is extremely
it,
powerful. So these are the types of constructs that we talk about in the book.
now, typically, I think you'll hear about it in the popular press as tribalism, which seems to me to be a term that you kind of avoided in the book. And I do like, in group and out group. It just sounds more precise, I guess, than tribalism, which seems to have a lot of baggage with it. Um, so,
Well, it's definitely about who do you identify with. So the in group is people you identify with, and out group are people you feel you do not identify with. And we unfortunately have in this country sorted ourselves too much into in groups and out groups. And we should be looking more at what we all have in common, because with the coronavirus, the coronavirus never cared what your political affiliation was, one way or the other. So it should
right.
never have been a politicized issue, but regrettably, it was greatly politicized. And that made people skeptical of, basic public health mechanisms like wearing a mask, which has been around since before the first plague in Europe.
How do we overcome the in group and out group thing with the internet? It seems the internet just makes that so much more difficult. I mean, is there a method or anything you can recommend? Like, I am awful on the internet. I recognize I'm terrible. I get very upset and angry when I see just nonsense and just total garbage. I feel like it's an attack on humanity itself, and so throwing f bombs, call people, especially if I'm in a particular mood, and I know that's not the right approach, but I don't know how. I mean, I justify that in many ways, but you know, has anyone developed any kind of guidelines or strategies for appropriately engaging with just the total BS that you'll see on the internet? So, for example, just to give you something concrete, tell me how I should have handled this. So, we're talking about COVID, and the guy says, "Oh, they don't even test for variants." And then I posted a link to the New York Times saying 99% of all cases are COVID. So obviously they're testing for variants. And then he says, "Oh, you read the New York Times, oh, that's all propaganda and this kind of thing." Now, how do you possibly combat that in a way that's going to make sense to this particular person?
Well, not in a tweet, that's for sure,
Right,
and not over social media, that's for sure.
right,
So there's not a single person who's followed Twitter who changed their mind based on a tweet. Not a single one.
right.
So that isn't how that works.
But
So we
we can't just cede ground, can we? We can't just let them spew whatever nonsense they want and let that go unchallenged. That's my kind of theory.
Well, you can push back, but it
Yeah,
isn't going to work to just have a Twitter fight. So the way that we recommend is for people to get out of their information bubbles. And that means us too. Everyone should get out of their information bubbles. They should read alternative, different kinds of outlets they haven't been reading. And they should vet information that they find online about science. We've published an article last year about how to do that. And there's steps that you can take. So when you read an article on science online, you should stop. You should open up another window. You should maybe even open it up in incognito mode so your platform doesn't know what you're searching for. You should read what's called laterally. So instead of just Googling and going down a list, you should open multiple windows and go across. Can you find all other sources of this information? And we recommend that you definitely check who wrote it, who's the source, what's the financial backing. So there's many steps that you can take before sharing information online. And if you're not sure about something, don't share it. Recently, not too long ago, Twitter instituted that, would you like to read this article first before you post it? Yeah. And that's a really good technique. But shouting into the internet is definitely not the way to persuade people. I think the way to persuade people is to have one-on-one conversations with people who have different points of view. If people are open to that, regrettably, people are getting less and less open to that.
Right.
But having real conversations, I'll give you an example. Barbara, my co-author, had a climate denier, self-proclaimed, come to one of her talks on the book, and he said, "Can I talk to you about this? I'm a climate denier." So she invited him to coffee, and they had a long and productive conversation and started talking about the future of their grandchildren. And the conversation was productive. Now, I don't think he changed his mind entirely in that conversation, but it is only through listening to other people and listening to what their concerns are and trying to understand where other people are coming from that you can produce change. You can't do it by yelling at somebody on the internet.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, there's no question. I do worry, though. I mean, as you mentioned, we seem to be becoming more radicalized. More and more people are becoming radicalized. Just another example from my personal experiences. My cousin's husband, hopefully he doesn't listen to this podcast, but he just went off the rails with the QAnon stuff. I guess you could call him like a political science denier. And he bought into all of these conspiracies. He's alienated his family. I mean, he still lives with them, but they just avoid him. Other relatives avoid him, and of course, we've seen this all over the place in news stories. So I find that alarming and really, really scary that we seem to be seeing really radical polarization going on. I mean, does that worry you, and how do you combat that?
Of course it does. I mean, we are separating into two groups in this country. And it's not Democrats and Republicans. It's reality-based people and
Exactly.
non-reality-based people.
Yeah.
And that's disconcerting, not just for science understanding, but for our political structure and our everyday life. I mean, look at the numbers right now on who's dying from COVID. It's the unvaccinated. And that's a tragedy.
Right.
And the reason that people are so hesitant about vaccines is because they have been fed deliberately misinformation about the vaccine, and they're in information bubbles where they're hearing only negative information from their friends and family on Facebook, only negative information from the news and media outlets they watch and read. And so they're getting a consistent message. And it's unfortunately not scientifically accurate. And we see the COVID death rates right now are overwhelmingly among the unvaccinated.
Right. And typically, polarization wouldn't be so alarming to me if the stakes were not so high. We have got to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and get rid of them completely by 2050. if there's any hope to stay within the 1.5 degree Celsius limit. So, the stakes are extremely high, and it's just so enormously frustrating that we seem to be moving away from a society that can cooperate and work together and come to agreement on these extremely important issues politically and scientifically. So I don't know that anyone has a solution to that, but do you have any thoughts on, what might be able to help us get back on track?
Well, I'm actually optimistic.
Hmm.
When we see the youth climate movement, they are very committed to having a future. They would like to have a future. And so they're very committed to the climate movement. And I've been working on climate change for about 15, 20 years. And this is a very different moment. We are really seeing much wider understanding and acceptance of the fact that we need to do something. So I think that climate denial is actually on the way down. It's certainly still a lot of resistance. So we definitely talk about doubt, denial, and resistance in the book. We have a lot of resistance, and that makes sense because people are scared. They're scared about, are they going to have to make dramatic changes to their lifestyle, and what does that mean? So people are scared, and I think we need to start to work on that because I think the level of denial is actually dropping.
Interesting. That would be good. And I definitely hope you are right. I don't know. To me, it's enormously alarming, and I worry a great deal. All right, so we got a couple chats here. Let's go through them. Oh, I can't scroll back to that one, but let me see if I can pull it up over here. But I guess one of the chats I think was directed at me. Why do I feel like I have to combat people online? And I do kind of think of it as combat, I guess. I'm not Catherine Hayhoe, who I respect and admire a great deal. I think she has a very good approach. She does all the things that you had talked about. Come to an understanding with people. That's just not my particular style. I do think we have to get, because I always say the other side is very rabid. Am I wrong on that? I mean, they're very convinced about what they believe.
Well, I think you're buying into the two sides,
Yeah.
and we just are, we've got to break that down. So, as I mentioned beginning, there's not a group of science deniers and a group of science acceptors.
Hmm.
Individual people tend to pick and choose and be cafeteria deniers or cafeteria acceptors, where they pick and choose.
Hmm.
So I think we have to avoid the us and them.
Hmm.
And nobody has joined your movement right after you called them stupid.
Right.
Not a single
Right.
person,
Right.
not one. We need people to join the climate movement, and we want to welcome them. We want to welcome people who are formerly climate deniers. We want to welcome them to the fight for the future of our planet and our species, humans. So I think it's the wrong approach to be bashing climate deniers
Mm.
online. It doesn't help. It doesn't change any minds. And we want people to change their mind.
Well,
So,
what I did yesterday is I posted a link to your book to one tweeter who I would have called all kinds of choice words, but I posted, here's a book I think you should read. And I just left it at that. No response from her,
well,
unfortunately.
that's definitely a better approach.
Right.
But I think we need to ask people what their concerns are. We need to ask people, why they believe what they believe. And the other thing I think is we can't paint everybody who questions science as a QAnon conspiracy theorist. And,
Sure.
that isn't the case. If you actually look at the numbers, that's a small group of people. There are many people in what we call the movable middle. There's a lot of people, like, for example, my niece initially heard on Facebook that the vaccine caused infertility, which is not true. So she was a little hesitant. She's not a vaccine denier. She was confused and she'd been fed misinformation. So we told her, talk to your doctor and see what your doctor says about this.
Hmm.
She did. She did talk to her doctor, and her doctor told her that was not a threat. She got vaccinated, and then she went back and told her friend, who had told her on Facebook that it causes infertility, that she should get vaccinated, and her friend got vaccinated. That's the way it works. It doesn't work by insulting people on Twitter.
All right. Well, I will definitely take that in consideration. Have improved over the years, but I still have a ways to go. All right. One thing that really piqued my curiosity in the book, and hopefully you can talk a little bit about that, which is the role of emotions in our ability to reason. And in fact, emotions and being rational are not two separate things. And this is something I've intuited, but I'm fascinated to learn more because it's the first time I've ever seen something like this, which is emotions are basically thinking, right? Is that the idea?
Well, there isn't a straight line dichotomy between, rationality and emotions. In fact, we think and reason with our emotions,
Hmm.
and that's what we have to do. That's because that's how we're made. But what we want to do is give ourselves time. It's not great to read a tweet, get angry, and respond. It's not great. So what you want to do instead is, step back, think about your emotions. Why am I angry? Why do I feel this way? Try to be empathetic. What was that person thinking? Why did they say that? What is their point of view? So you want your emotions to work in service of thinking and reasoning, not against thinking and reasoning, and they absolutely can. We have to let them and welcome them into the thinking and reasoning process.
Gotcha. Well, I definitely want to read that study. That was by Mary Helen
Mary
Imordino
Helen
Yang.
Imodino Yang's
Yeah,
research is a leading of emotion researchers showing how emotions work in service of thinking and reasoning.
yeah, that's very interesting to me. I wrote a essay I'll share with you. I mean, it's not anything sophisticated, but I'm interested to get your feedback on it because it kind of talks about that a little bit. All right, we only have about 7 minutes left. Let's solve the world's problems in that time. Talk about big tech's role in all this. We've touched upon it a little bit. The internet. I'm a big fan of Marshall McLuhan. I mean, I read him many years ago, and very interested in communication theory and how these technologies change us in very fundamental ways. And these technologies have been introduced by these large corporations who make gobs of money, possibly undermining democracy and society itself. I mean, at least for my opinion. Do you see any things, immediate things that they can do? So, for I'm of the opinion, for example, they should just ban climate deniers, which is not going to happen. But I mean, I think I would love it if they did. And of course, that would cause a big brouhaha. But did you see anything, any practical things they could do immediately to try to help, um, limit the just damage, I guess, of what they're doing to us?
Absolutely. We have seen that. We saw the Facebook whistleblower who recently testified in front of Congress talking about practices they did to curb the tide of misinformation that were effective, and then they stopped doing them. But absolutely, they can. So the algorithms that are built into these systems um, force you down rabbit holes. You don't fall down a rabbit hole, you are pulled down a rabbit hole. So she gave testimony about how Facebook created a false identity, a false account of a person, and they described this person as a middle-aged white woman, conservative Christian from the Midwest. 3 days after they formed her account, she was invited to join a QAnon conspiracy group.
Mm.
So people are pulled down rabbit holes by the algorithms that monetize misinformation. And so, can they do something about that? Absolutely, they can. Some of the practices that we talked about already is on this issue of, do you want to read this article first before you share it? Taking down blatant misinformation that is just off the pale. They need to continue to do that. So there are practices they could build in. They could monitor misinformation better than they do. They could de incentivize monetization of misinformation. So in other words, misinformation makes money, and people are making money off of misinformation because misinformation is shared more than truthful information. So that's all built into the way their algorithms work, and they
Right.
can change the algorithms if they want to.
Right.
It would affect the bottom line, perhaps, and that's one of their motivations for not changing it. But do they have the capacity to do a better job on stemming the tide of misinformation spread? They absolutely do.
Another thing I worry about is the political attacks on science itself. And this was made crystal clear in Michael Mann's book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, I think came out in 2012. And being a political guy, it was just disgusting. And there seems to be something pathological going on here where people are deliberately smearing others for their own political gain or monetary gain. And so, my question is, when does, denial become like a twisted psychopathy or pathology? Uh, and I worry that I mean, look at our last president. I mean, this is not a normal guy. This is not a well balanced, emotionally stable person. And yet he was elected president. So do you worry at all that this kind of, twisted, and I'm using, layperson terms here, obviously not very scientific, but, very dangerous worldviews are, could possibly win out here.
Well, of course, I'm deeply concerned about extremism, political extremism, and science denial extremism. But again, I think it doesn't do us a service to paint this picture
Hmm.
of there's two groups.
So you're
There's
saying I
one
should
group that's
avoid that then?
completely reality based
Right.
and following the science, and then there's this other group who's a QAnon nutwing. That isn't
Right.
really reflective of reality.
Gotcha.
What is reflective? There are some extremists, and then there's a lot of people in the middle. And the people in the middle are confused or misunderstand or have nefarious motives or are making money off of this information. And I think there's so much movement that can be done in the middle
Is it worth it
that we
to,
should focus our attention on bringing people back into the reality fold.
is it worth it, do you think, to attack those more sinister forces, I'll call them? Do you think there's anything to be gained from doing that, from calling out Jim Inhofe? No?
No,
Interesting.
because what happens is they become cult heroes and they just develop a bigger following.
Hmm. Interesting.
That doesn't mean we should let them spew misinformation in online platforms. I would encourage, all platforms to take down extremist information.
Hmm.
But no, I mean, attacking people on social media is useless.
Well, no, I mean, not attacking them directly, but I mean, pointing out, how, why what they're doing is wrong and bad. I mean, is there anything wrong with doing that? Mentioning, hey, this guy's lying to you, or should we just try to ignore him?
Well, no one's going to believe you. So
Yeah.
it is, I mean, we definitely want to share correct information.
Uh-huh.
So I would just do that.
So
I
you're saying
wouldn't, I
focus on the
would
positive.
say sharing the correct information, but just saying that, this guy's lying and deceiving you, they're not going to believe you. So it isn't really a productive, useful thing to do.
All right.
But sharing more reliable information, you can definitely do that.
Okay. Well, I will definitely try. I can't promise I will follow that advice to a T, but I will definitely take your expert opinion into strong advisement. So I appreciate that very much. All right, we are about 30 seconds over. I really want to show my appreciation for you spending your time with me, my humble little new home with the live stream. Hopefully, didn't ruin your career with it, but I think it went pretty well. But yeah, what we're going to do, we'll break up some of the interesting points that you bring out into clips, and maybe as there's new developments in the science, we'd love to have you back on. And I really, really, thank you very much. I'm kind of like giddy being able to talk to someone who really knows what they're talking about for a change, you know. So,
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for having us. I appreciate our time together today.
all right. Thank you, Dr. Sinatra. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.